Eddie George pushes back on the notion that he was only interviewed by the Chicago Bears to fill a Rooney Rule quota. Oh, yeah, it's locked on HBCU. Play my music.
You are Locked On HBCU, your daily podcast covering HBCU sports. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, family? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On HBCU podcast, your number one daily one-stop shop for everything HBCU athletics, Monday through Friday, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I, of course, am Darrion Gray, a.k.a. the Mouth of the South, Texas Southern alum and former TSU Herald Sports editor and current contributing writer at USA Today's Saints Wire. Thank you for going on this journey with me. Make a Locked On HBCU your first listen of the day every day. And remember, just because the mic cuts off does not mean that the journey is over. Just means it's time to follow me on Twitter at South Exclusives. Starts with an S and ends with an S. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONCollege to get $20 off your first purchase. We'll wrap up today's episode the same way that we started, with Tennessee State. This is our Tiger version of the season in review, but we're going to kick it off with something that is Tennessee State related, but not quite a recap or a look forward. Eddie George says this was not a Rooney Rule situation when he interviewed with the Chicago Bears. I'll give my opinion on it first, and then I'll give what he said in response, not necessarily to me, but there's many people who feel like George only interviewed with the Bears to fulfill a Rooney Rule quota. For those who aren't paying attention to NFL hiring requirements, I understand, right? Because at the end of the day, all that matters is who your coach is going to be. But we know how our coaches tend to get, and when I say our coaches, I mean black coaches, not just HBCU, but our coaches tend to get the shaft in these type of situations. And in order to try to protect that, they do this Rooney Rule. You have to require X amount of, or interview X amount of minorities. But a lot of times it's shams, because it's like, okay, I'll meet my quota and then I'll go get who I want to get. I personally don't think that this was a completely genuine interview. Do I think that there's reasons they picked Eddie George? Yes. Do I think he adds parts of the story that makes this a little bit more fascinating? Of course, I'm not going to lie. There's one particularly about the timeline in which he accepted the interview. But to me, it's going to be very difficult for me to not think that George's interview with the Bears was, it's going to be hard for me not to say it's a sham. That's my personal opinion. Do I think that there's some positive things that came out of it? Yes. Do I think there's a reason that he was picked? Yes. And he addresses those. But at the end of the day, they hired Ben Johnson without ever bringing him in for a second interview, which that tells you exactly who they wanted. The Bears knew they wanted Ben Johnson. The only thing that determines whether or not this is all the interviews were shams or not is how much did they know the interest was mutual. I think that's the real question. And I don't know if Eddie George applies there. I don't know if Eddie George, even his interview, even impacts any of that, because I don't think that he was the second or third choice, in my opinion. I mean, this is a professional football team. It would be pretty surprising to see him make the jump from FCS to NFL as a head coach who had no previous head coaching experience prior to 4 seasons ago. So I think that it was just in general a very difficult leap to believe would happen. I know you may wonder, well, didn't you come on and speak highly of the interview? Yes, I did. I thought they had interviewed more than 2 minorities at this point, but I think that was just the third. I think that was just the second minority. But that was one of the reasons I was hype on it. But then the second reason is I think there's still a lot of good things that can come from this. I still believe that when you see Eddie George get interviewed by the Chicago Bears, whether you feel like it's a sham or not, you may question what is he doing at Tennessee State that earned him that position. And that's one of the things that he will address in these quotes that I'll read in a little bit. But there is a reason that Eddie George was the guy. Whether we want to say he was just filling a quota or not, I do think picking him in particular means a little bit more than just the Rooney Rule. Because you could have picked, like the Patriots picked 2 guys who we knew wasn't getting no jobs. We knew wasn't even interested in just whatever. Just go ahead and throw them in there. But this was an interesting selection if you're just trying to fit the quota. Let's keep it at that. But look, Eddie George, he brought Tennessee State to the FCS playoffs last year. He did a lot of good things. And I think if you look at it under a microscope, it becomes even more impressive. So I do think that there's people who are paying attention. Let's put it this way. There are people who are believed to be attractive in this world that a lot of their attractiveness is based off of people being attracted to them, if you know what I mean. Essentially, that person, you were told that person was attractive, whether it was with actions or whether it was with words. There are people you have been told are attractive, and some of them you have believed, even though you may not have thought it originally. And the only reason you changed your mind is because people kept being in your ear or kept seeing things in front of you. They're attractive, they're attractive, they're attractive, they're attractive. And eventually you believed it. I think that that same type of principle could happen with Eddie George, who was like, well, why is he being interviewed? And if you go look at what he did, it was impressive. So I think if you look closely, you may look at him as a head coaching candidate at other places. This is just putting somebody on the radar, in my opinion. But is it a Rooney Rule quota? This is what George says. He says, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to interview had I not had a previous relationship and the respect for it. They were really pushing for me to come up, even when I said, give me 48 hours to think about it. I thought they may say they didn't have that much time, but they didn't. Mind you, the time that they thought they were going to have was with the Lions ended up, they were probably supposed to win at least one, maybe two playoff games, right? Like if we're just going to be honest, they were supposed to be in the NFC Championship game, if not the Super Bowl. And then Jaden Daniels and the Washington Commanders squashed all of that. So I do think they thought they had more time than they ended up having. But that being said, look, guys, George, I just don't think was getting his job. But the idea that he said, yeah, give me a little bit, and they waited, I do think it speaks volumes. I do think his previous relationship with the Bears speaks volumes. Like, this isn't about whether or not he was going to get the job. I just don't feel like that jump was realistic as quickly as as quickly as it would have been if he gotten hired, right? But I do think that it means something. I do think it shows the respect that the Bears have. They did not have to choose Eddie George. I do believe they chose him because they had a previous relationship with him. I do believe it was a little bit more than just meeting a quota, but I don't think it was so far to say he was a legitimate option. There's a big difference there. And he addresses the Rooney Rule in general. This is his feeling on it. The thing about the Rooney Rule is it doesn't matter how you get in the room, whether it's through the front door, back door, side door, window, or the roof. If I get in the room, you still got to deal with me. Then I've got to go out there and perform, meaning I still got to interview well. That is true. That is true. And I think that the idea of this being a sham takes this out of the window. But at the same time, we've seen people be like, oh, they interview really well. I don't know what the percentages are on whether or not those guys end up being successful. I don't know what the percentages are on whether or not those guys end up getting hired at a different place. I don't know. But what I do know is that there's a jump between FCS and NFL. You jump G5, you jump P5, right? Like there's a subdivision within the FBS that is unspoken, but it's understood. I do believe you're going to see G5 people be interested. I do believe that people will come calling Tennessee State head coach Eddie George. This will not be the last time. And is it going to be all because of the NFL? No, but maybe if it's not created by the NFL hype, you could look at it as a sign of things to come at the worst. That's my personal opinion. I think that Eddie George has done enough at Tennessee State to have people knocking on his door. The Chicago Bear cosign of sorts. It really depends on how people look at it too. If they look at how you just meeting the Rooney Rule, then maybe it doesn't have any sort of boost. But I think that people will question why they chose him and look deeper. Once again, this is all about forcing people to look deeper. And once they look deeper, they will want George. That is just my personal opinion. That's the way I see what he's been able to do. But let's break down exactly what George has been able to do. At Tennessee State, I believe this was the year that everything came together for the Tigers. Let's explore that as we wrap up, as we continue with Locked On HBCU. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. And Gametime is the only place that I go get any of my tickets. I don't care if it's for the Kendrick Scissor show. Maybe you want to get some tickets for the Super Bowl if they're not sold out already. I know they're going to cost you an arm and a leg, but trust me, Gametime is going to make it way more affordable than any of the other places. The way that I view Game Time for being the best, or the reason I view Game Time for being the best, is the fact that they don't hide anything. They don't hide what your view is. I tried to buy tickets to a wrestling event, and I was able to see that they're going to have me behind this obstruction to where I couldn't see. Cool. Don't need those tickets. Don't just look at a number and purchase. You look at everything involved. You look at the number you see is everything involved. It's all inclusive. You're going to get the fees that are tacked on. I hate it, man. I know I say this all the time, but it grinds my gears when I see a ticket price and then I go in and all of a sudden it's $30 in processing before I get the tax. No, not with Game Time. You get the all-in pricing, plus you go ahead and get $20 off when you use the code Locked On College. Go to download the Game Time app today and make your first purchase. As we continue rolling on today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day. Every day for your second listen, make sure you're checking out Locked On today. There's big trades happening in the NBA. It's going crazy during Pro Bowl weekend. It's probably going to extend into Super Bowl week. All right. Make sure you're staying up with all of the biggest stories on Locked On today. We talked about Eddie George's comments about the Rooney Rule and how he doesn't really feel like that's what applies to him. That's not how he views the interview with the Chicago Bears. But for me, I want to look at 2024 now, because there was one thing that he said now that we know he's going to be staying with the Tennessee State Tigers. George says, we still got some work to do here, and we're working on it. That is a view towards 2025. But what I will say is that if we're working on excelling, all he has to do is follow the 2024 blueprint, because 2024 was the year where everything came together for Tennessee State. You go through and look at the years of the Eddie George era, and I'm going to go year by year just so you can see where he went as a overall record and then also in a conference record. Mind you, this is the first year, no, maybe the second year of the joint Big South OVC football conference. 2021, George went 5-6 with a 3-3 conference record. 2022, 4-7 and a 2-3 conference record. Next year, 6-5 and a 2-4 conference record. 9-4 this past season with a 6-2 conference record. You look at all of those records and you see kind of a slow increase. Of course, you went 5-4-6. You kind of hovering around that same area. But I would say you're making some improvements, especially if you take over the last 3 years. That second season was a bit of a sophomore slump. But regardless, you're in that same 1 to 2 game range. So, but I also think you see a better September, a better October from them. So if you look at the records, that's the first thing that'll jump out to you. But having tracked some of this stuff during the season, I feel a little bit different. Of course, I could look at 9-4 opposed to 6-5 and say, oh, much better record. First off, you played more games, meaning you made it to the playoffs. But I could also look at a 6-2 and say you finally got a winning record in conference. And I think those are legitimate reasons to say Tennessee State improved, right? Like if you want to look at the 6-2 conference record versus 2-2 or 2-3, 2-4, 3-3. Eddie George and the Tennessee State Tigers won 6 conference games this year, opposed to the 7 that they won in total over his first 3 seasons as the head coach. Yes, that's a clear improvement, but it's also an indication of my favorite improvement by Tennessee State. Tennessee State finally succeeded in the month of November. 3-3, 2-3, 2-4. Matter of fact, if you just boil it down in November, I don't even have to go through and say, oh, well, this game was played in October or this game was played. In the month of December, Eddie George went 1-3, 1-3, 1-3. It was poor ends to the season. If you look at it, that means they were looking pretty good going into that last month, but they failed at the end each year until 2024. The improvement in the month of November to go from 1-3 in each of his first 3 seasons to then being 3-1 in this final year, not only was it impressive, it was imperative. Because if you don't go 3-1, you're not making the playoffs. If you don't go 3-1, you're not winning a share of the conference championship. And you could point to, oh, the first and second win was that last win against Southeast Missouri in a gotta-have-it game against a team that has the lead in the conference was extremely impressive, because you knew right now my season is on the line. You knew that right now, if I win, I have a chance at a share of the conference championship. You knew that nothing was guaranteed. Nothing was guaranteed for Tennessee State going into that game, but you had to win in order to have a shot at making the playoffs. You ain't punch your ticket with a win. You punch your ticket with a bunch of other stuff happening, and they ended up saying, yeah, this is a quality team. 9-4, 9-3 in the regular season. 6-2. Finally, a winning record in the last month. Finally, a winning record in conference play. But you go through it, man. Like, look at 2023. They went 6-5, but they were only 2-4 in conference play. That tells you that they were dominating out of conference teams. It's really interesting, and it's funny because the Southern Heritage Classic has no longer been Jackson State versus Tennessee State for the last 2 seasons. I would have really loved to see JSU versus TSU in this season. I'll be honest with you. Just to see the old Southern Heritage Classic would have been a real treat because I think both of these teams were really good. And that would have allowed Jackson State to play the best team in the MEAC, the best team outside of the MEAC. They obviously would have played the second best team in the SWAC. They would have been able to go through basically a gauntlet of the top guys. The only thing you would have missed was North Carolina Central. But outside of that, they missed North Carolina Central and Jackson State, or excuse me, and Tennessee State. That would have been fun. But this isn't about this right now. You look at those records, you look at what they did in November, and that's my favorite way to look at them improving. And I thought it was a monkey on their back. I thought it was a demon that they were struggling to shake because you can't keep getting off the hot starts. And at a certain point, the goodwill, the honeymoon phase was going to wear out, and you were going to start saying, excuse me, there was going to be more people who were going to start picking up on what I'm talking about. And what I'm talking about is the struggles at the end of the season. I don't think many people talked about it, but once you go to year 4 and every single season you're struggling, that was going to be a talking point. It never will be now, because in this year, even if you fail next year in 2024, you finally shook that. You finally bucked that trend. And I got to salute to him, man, especially that last game. Goatee Eddie George is different. I'm sorry. I'm going to probably I'm going to try to bring him on the show. Hopefully we can get that set up. I'm going to have to ask him about it. Goatee Eddie George is different, y'all. So I can't wait. Anyway, let's keep pushing forward because we looked at what made 2024 so special for them. But what about who made 2024 so special for Tennessee State? I have a few stars, and it's going to be hard to break it down on the defensive side, but I'll try my best as we wrap up today's episode of Locked On HBCU. As we're wrapping up today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day, making it all the way to segment 3, and I thank you 2 times for that. Thank you. Eddie George has bucked the trend, or excuse me, has bucked the notion that this was a Rooney Rule interview for him in Chicago. But he does say that they still have more work now that he's at TSU for a 5th season, excuse me. We looked at what made TSU so special last year. Now we're going to look at what makes them, or who made them special in last year's season. I feel like Tennessee State had a good amount of stars. Like the star power on that team was pretty high last year. If we're talking about just standouts, maybe not star power as far as name recognition, but just standout players, they had a lot of them. Tennessee State, I would say, had their most stars on the defensive line, but that was not where their biggest stars were. The biggest star to me, because I think the quarterback naturally gets a lot, and Draylen Ellis did have a good season that we will break down, but the biggest star of Tennessee State's season, in my opinion, was Boogie Trotter, the defensive back. He was everywhere. He did everything for this team. You're looking at the 62 tackles, 3rd on the team. His 3 interceptions, 2nd on the team. His 7 pass deflections were 2nd on the team. His 3 fumble recoveries were 1st on the team. He forced a fumble as well. You're looking at a guy who just was a ball magnet. You're looking at a player who was a true impact player in the secondary, and that was one of the things that they did really well. They were the best pass defense in the Big South OVC, him and Jalen McClendon, because McClendon had the most pass deflections by a Tennessee State player. I think he might have had the most in the conference, to be honest. No, he was second. But the UT Martin guy played one more game. Never mind. That being said, he still had more per game. But McClendon had 16. He had one interception, but 15 breakups. That was insane ball production. But anyway, we was talking about Boogie Trotter. Trotter was out here intercepting passes, returning for touchdowns. He was recovering fumbles. He was forcing fumbles. He was making tackles. Just the ball in the air. It ain't even got to be a turnover. Boogie Trotter is going to be a player who is severely missed because he entered the portal. He went to the P5 ranks. So Boogie Trotter is going to be a player who is severely missed on that team because there's not much you can do to replicate him. There's not much you can do to replace him with one singular player. You gotta have multiple guys. That's just mandatory. So in general, though, because I don't want to talk about replacing him, Trotter was an Aeneas Williams Award finalist. And I always viewed that as James Burgess's award to lose. But Trotter was the only guy who I felt like had a legitimate shot to steal that away from Burgess. I thought that his blend of physicality, forcing turnovers, just pure good coverage, scoring, like he did everything you could possibly want from a defensive back. So with all of that, I had to look and be like, he might get it. I remember it was 3 guys. I think it was I don't remember who the third was, but those were the top 2 for me for sure. Another guy that you have is Karate Benson, the wide receiver, 1,000 yards, led the team in receptions and yards, touchdowns. He was a true impact wide receiver. When I think about what Karate Benson did, I tend to think about the Tennessee Tech game. And I know that they lost that game, and I think he may have even had a fumble in that game. But the reason it sticks out to me is because anytime Draylen Ellis needed something, that's who he went to. And it was in that moment. It was earlier in the season, so that's another reason it sticks out. But in that moment, I realized Karate Benson is a go-to wide receiver. Every number 1 guy is not a go-to wide receiver. I want to make that crystal clear. You have a lot of players who are number 1s. They are the best player on that team or the best receiver on that team, but they are not go-to options for real. I'm trying to think of somebody who fits that build. I can't think of it. Most in the NFL, you would probably say are go-to, or they have a really good secondary piece, but that I don't need an example. You get what I mean. This guy is somebody who you're covered, I'm throwing. Period. You're covered, and I'm throwing the football. I thought Benson was a really good player for them. And in that game, he had 9 catches for 99 yards. It wasn't even 100 yards. He had a game with 150. Had a couple games with 120. But that game stuck out to me with the plays that he did make. Screw the yards. I'm talking about the moments you needed it. Third down, or the drive has been, or the offense has been pushed back due to a penalty. It didn't matter. It was like months ago, so I can't remember specific situations, but you've seen Benson rise every single occasion, though. Every single occasion. Then he also absolutely torched Howard for 5 catches for 153 yards. But I want to applaud him because of everything he did. One of the more impressive aspects of his game was how he rose to the occasion yet again against Montana in the playoffs. And he ended up having arguably his best game of the season. 11 catches, 122 yards, 2 touchdowns. And I know you're looking at that and saying, well, he had a 5 for 153 game against Howard, excuse me. It's cool. It's actually really great. Let me not say it's cool. That's a great game. But he had 2 touchdowns in this game, his most in the season. He had 11 catches, with ties his most in the season. And his 122 was second most in the season. I thought Karate Benson was extremely impactful. And who was throwing him the football? Draylen Ellis, who finally got his opportunity to be the guy. I think that he's been waiting for this moment, and I think he was deserving of this moment. But Draylen Ellis has been waiting to be the man at Tennessee State for 2-3 years, and it was a lot of hot potato that was being played at the quarterback position. You finally let him just go in there and start. Forget, if I mess up, I still have my job. And I think that that's good for a player. You don't want him to be absolutely relaxed, but you don't want him looking over his shoulder at every moment. I know we say iron sharpens iron, competition, and all of that, but I think that it can lead to you playing a little too safe. So I'm glad that he was able to switch that up. He ended up going for, let's see the exact numbers here. He had 3,029 yards, 24 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. So he had a strong 3-to-1 touchdown ratio. You like what you saw from Draylen Ellis. Now, I said the defensive line had the most stars, and this is the difficult part. So I'm just going to go with the top four and kind of read off what they did, because Tennessee State had four players who were in double digits for tackles for a loss. You had Sanders Ellis at 14, who led the pack, Keandre Booker, 12, Eric George, 12, Chris Walker, 11. When you look at Walker and you look at Booker, they both had 6 and 6.5 sacks. George had 5.5. That wasn't really Sanders' game to be that. He only had 2.5 sacks, but I mean, he's a linebacker, so it's a little bit different. But Sanders Ellis, I don't remember if he entered the transfer portal or not, but I do believe that and I think he did for some reason. But I think that no, he still has that in his bio that he's Tennessee State, so that's good. Obviously, we know. Obviously, yeah. Okay, cool. Sorry, I just seen something, and no, yeah, he entered the transfer portal like I thought. It's still in there, so I guess he hasn't landed anywhere. There's a chance he could come back, but anyway, the point is they have some impact players. It's not about what they're going to do in 2025. When you're this good, you have to reload. Sanders Ellis was extremely impressive from a freshman linebacker. A freshman linebacker to come in and rack up as many tackles as he did, for a freshman linebacker to come in and get in the backfield and penetrate. You're not supposed to get 14 tackles for a loss as a linebacker, right? So just in general, I thought that this was a very impressive season by Ellis, a very impressive season by George. This was a strong defense. I think that the rushing numbers didn't showcase it at all times. They ended up being 5th in rushing yards defensively, but in general, this was a strong unit. So I appreciate you for listening to our Tennessee State season in review. I know it's it's actually February. We're going to keep this rolling. I think we'll probably stop once we get to spring ball. At that point, we probably won't be wrapping up seasons that much, but we only have like a couple left. I'm not going to be doing Mississippi Valley State. I'm not going to be doing, I may do Texas Southern because that's just it's my alma mater, but I'm not going to be doing a lot of schools. I'm not going to be doing I'm not going to be naming people I'm not doing, but a lot of them I'm not going to do. Just in general, I think it's good to recap some of these guys while also looking forward to what they could be in 2025. That's kind of how we're transitioning. But I appreciate you for listening to me brainstorm with you guys, and I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day. Until next time that we hear each other, family, take care, stay blessed. Peace.